Welcome to the State of the Nation, where we look often at the South African picture, but South Africa doesn't exist in isolation. South Africa lives in a global world where things are interconnected. We know that with some of our coverage of the recent BRICS summit and the impact that would have on South Africa. But there are bigger things happening in the world. We see, in the recent past, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but more recently, the flare-up of terrible violence in the Middle East and Hamas's attack on Israel and Israel's response to that attack. And it does once again highlight the fact that geopolitics matter. So who better to discuss geopolitics with than the one and only Clem Sunter. Clem, welcome back to the State of the Nation. Great to have you back.
Thank you, Mike. I remember all those breakfasts with great delight that we used to do.
And I can tell you that they've started to make a comeback, and pretty soon we'll have you back, and I'm sure everybody would want to hear from you. But let's kick off by understanding you have been at the forefront of scenario planning long before it was a thing. It's now quite an accepted part of analysis of events in the world. But let's just talk about it. Where you've become synonymous is with your famous flags, using flags as a methodology to explain the importance of situations. Just explain to us how your flags work for those who haven't heard about this before.
Well, Mike, the whole purpose of flags is to look at all the driving forces that are changing the present into the future. And I have the clockwork flags, which are ticking away, which are changing the future in a fairly precise way, such as the aging of the world's population. And then you have the cloudy flags, like this terrible killing in Israel by Hamas just over a week ago, and equally the Ukrainian war, which are cloudy flags. One has very little knowledge of how they're going to pan out. But what you can do is play scenarios of stories, of possibilities of how these driving forces can change the world. And what I've found with all the years I've been a futurist is that you've got to look at a flag and then you've got to watch it 24/7 and see how it can, go into a different scenario. And that's the way you look at the future. You can't be a prophet and sort of say this is going to happen. But what you can do is say these are the possibilities that flow out of the flags.
So it would be like approaching a traffic light and it's turned from green to amber, or from amber to red, and that has certain implications for that particular situation. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And in fact, you've added a very good extra point, which is obviously as the flags change, so you have to consider what your own actions are going to be. In The Mind of a Fox, which I published with Chantal Aubry in 2001, one of the points we made is that not only must you scan the future like a fox looking in the forest, but you've got to have the agility of a fox to respond to whatever the changes are.
Well, certainly, if one sticks with the story of Israel, certainly one of those flags would have changed by Hamas's actions, which were certainly of a scale not seen in decades. Explain to us which flag that, the flags that have gone up there.
Well, Mike, I wrote an article in July for News 24. And
it's July of 2023.
Yeah, July 2023. And, the number one flag, and it has been the number one flag, since the late 1980s, is the religious flag. The fact that the world seems to be more deeply divided by religion than it has been, for any part of the previous century. And of course, that flag really went up the pole with 9/11. And now this dreadful killing of Israelis by Hamas and the unfolding human catastrophe in the Gaza Strip. It is, religion is a very good thing. It gives faith to people to do good things, but sometimes it just leads to these terrible events. And here we have it. And it's why it is the number one flag in the portfolio of flags that I watch going into the future.
And now, Clem, obviously, it's hard to predict what's going to happen in that region because you really do have an angle where certain more of the radical exponents of Islam are talking about the eradication of Israel. This is going to ramp things up. I mean, I presume that this flag goes from red to very deep red if one looks at what's happening now.
Yeah, it is. It is something that is unthinkable, and I don't know where this is going to lead. One has to watch both sides because Israel is a very small country, and that event was absolutely ghastly. But equally, this idea that you can move 1 million people south in Gaza and leave behind, for example, hospitals in Gaza City, which are looking after kids and who've already been injured in the bombing of Gaza. It just shows that war is a dreadful human thing, and the sooner this ends, the better. But I don't know how it's going to end, or even whether it's going to escalate into something wider involving other Middle Eastern countries. All I know is that the risk profile of that part of the world has gone up, and that's why I had it as the number one flag in the July article, because up till now it's been more about the impact of this flag on the West with the attacks on 9/11 and also the attack 7/7 in London, where I actually was at the time. But what the last few years have shown is that this flag has kind of moved from the sort of attacks on Western cities back to the Middle East for various reasons. But obviously one of the principal reasons is that the whole Palestinian issue has not yet been properly resolved by the parties concerned. And it just leaves a real issue out there on the table. But equally, you've obviously had the other point that I made in this article that Iran is getting very close to developing a nuclear bomb, and both Israel and America have said they won't be allowed to do it. So obviously, you have to watch that as a flag.
It's an interesting one because I suppose, Clem, you call it a religious flag, which sort of half indicates that it's one religion versus another. But that's not really the case here, is it? Because you don't really have, a battle. This is hardly the Crusades, where an army of Christians are invading the lands of Islam, etc. This is almost sort of an Islamic flag only, because they seem to be on the warpath with everybody who isn't Islamic.
Yeah, but one's got to be very careful about that, because there are a great many number of peace-loving Muslims in the world. And yes, in the original book, I wrote about this flag called the New Century. I did talk of fundamental Islam being a possible way for this flag to go up the pole. But many people would say that the kind of conditions for conflict between the major religions is just part of the world today. And our scenario team really talked about the intensifying competition between the major religions of the world.
Now, that's not the only conflict in the world, and the second conflict can hardly be called part of the religious flag. And that was Russia invaded Ukraine, in which case largely you've got people of a similar religion. What flag does that trigger?
Yeah, we talk of the red flag. And again, it's been one of the principal flags I've watched, particularly since the annexation of Crimea in 2014 by Russia. And I wrote a book called Flag Watching in 2015, in which I suggested that this particular flag could lead to World War III between Russia and America. It hasn't. It has been contained. And yes, the West is providing weapons to the Ukrainians, but it isn't providing people. The Ukrainians so far haven't, seriously damaged Russia with missiles or drones and in terms of taking out large parts of Moscow. So we're not yet at that stage of World War III, but we certainly have a situation now of a highly polarized world where you have Russia on one side with some of its allies, and on the other side you have the West. And again, one doesn't know how this particular war is going to pan out because there's no sign of negotiation between the current rulers of Ukraine and Russia. Russia wants to keep the land that it's acquired. Ukraine wants all its territory back. And so, the kind of scenario is just an ongoing war, which creates huge loss of life on both the Ukrainian and Russian sides and destruction of property. It's just an awful characteristic of the human species that we fall into this category of conflict, which causes so much misery and pain. And I'm no better than anybody else at saying exactly how the Ukrainian war is going to end. But I do have another flag called the leadership flag, which, is so important to the world. The world leaders who you're living with at the time. My dad had a perfectly reasonable business career in the 1930s, but there happened to be a leader called Adolf Hitler rising to power in Germany. And that meant that his life from 39 to 1945 was completely disrupted by serving in the British Army. You can have good leadership flags. Like at the end of the 80s, you had Maggie Thatcher, Reagan, and Mikhail Gorbachev, and they had a positive relationship with one another, which led to the end of the Cold War and the termination of the Soviet Union. We had a fantastic leadership flag with Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk, who avoided exactly what's going on in the wars we're seeing around the world by having a proper negotiation for peace. And I must say, Cyril Ramaphosa and Rolf Mayer were absolutely critical too to that negotiation process. So you can have good leadership, which can change the world positively. Right now, we have three old men. We have Joe Biden. We have Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, and they don't have any real relationship with one another. Certainly not positive, and that's why the world is going through some of the crises it is, because of the absence of global leadership, and we'll have to wait for the next generation of leaders.
And sadly, one strong man begets another strong man. There's every chance that America might soon join the fray by reintroducing Donald Trump to the world, and then you've got sort of outsized characters, running those mighty countries almost by decree, isn't it?
Well, as a futurist, it's almost surreal that there is Donald Trump, with 4 or 5 legal cases against him for which he could go to jail. And he's still the absolute frontline Republican nominee. And now we're seeing this, kind of paralysis of choosing a speaker for the House of Representatives in the United States because of the kind of rift between the far right in the Republican Party and the centre right. There's a sort of lack of leadership in the kind of political arena all around the world. And what is emerging is which is another flag that I have, is this anti-establishment flag of populism and people becoming much more nationalistic and self-interested again. It really is terrible that we're living through this world of lack of leadership.
Now, there's a couple of flags that are leaning on one another here, because you did mention Xi Jinping, under the leadership scenario, as well as there's a very credible sort of, if you want to call it, you've called it the red flag. We did touch on it. You've got Russia under Putin seemingly wanting to recreate the Soviet Union, but he's getting tacit support, and certainly some logistical support from China. Do you think there's a chance that we see a re-emergence in another form of a Cold War or on ideological basis?
Absolutely. It is. We'll get to the actual scenarios I play for the world shortly, but the other major issue at the moment is China's rivalry with America, which America's been for so long the kind of superpower in the world, in a way that maybe Britain was in the middle of the last century. And they're having to get used to the fact that there is another nation that is rivaling them in the world with a completely different ideology. The Chinese economy is now the second largest economy in the world. And so, they are now looking at each other in a pretty conflictual way. And of course, the biggest issue is Taiwan, where China says that it is part of the mainland China, and the Americans are saying that they're saying that Taiwan is independent, but they're not pushing it as far as saying that it's got to be a separate country. It is a sort of slight ambiguity in the American side. But recently, they've really infuriated the Chinese. And so it is possible going to lead to a war over Taiwan in the same way that we have the war in Ukraine. So the world's in a very, very fragile state at the moment.
Now, Clem, one of the issues that does play into this is your other flag, the grey flag, and that is people are, we've had years of great scientific advance. We've had a relatively peaceful era for the last, post-war era, a few skirmishes here and there, but nothing of the nature of what we've seen in the past. And this has meant that many countries, in fact, just about every country, has seen a dramatic aging of the populations. Now, before we get into the actual implication of an older population, there certainly seems to be the effect of the way that those aging populations view the world. If one looks at America, the aging population in America seems to be the ones that are supporting Trump. The aging Russians seem to be the ones that are supporting Putin. What is the political implication of this, of the grey flag?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. Is old people tend to be more conservative in their views, and look for protection by their own rulers, and this obviously is affecting the political dynamic, but it also is in many ways affecting the economic dynamic of those countries in a way that financial advisors simply don't understand. I've always said, ever since one of my mentors, Pierre Wack, who was a scenario planner for Royal Dutch Shell, who talked about the possible collapse of the Japanese economy in 1988, because he said they're the oldest country in the world. And he said if they have a property crash, they're never going to grow fast again. And that's exactly what happened in 1990. And to this day, Japan's economy has grown at around 0.5% per annum, as opposed to the 7 to 8% per annum in the 1970s and 80s. And the same is applying to Europe now. It's an old set of countries. The UK is an old country. That's why the permanent crisis with national health insurance. In that sense, America, with a younger, more resilient population, is naturally going to have a higher economic growth rate of around maybe 3 to 3.5% versus Europe, which is going to sit at around 1%. And where this flag is now going up in a major way is China, because of its one-child policy. Suddenly, China has become middle-aged. The number of elderly people is increasing hugely in China. And so, yeah, it's going to have a dramatic impact on the economic growth rate of China. And that's why I say possibly India can come through, because it does have a younger population. So, yes, the flag, the grey flag of the aging of the world's population has an impact on both the political and economic dynamic of that country.
Now, Clem, that is something that one would imagine. I was just looking at some figures recently. It is a topic that I've really followed closely, and that is the term for it is fertility rate, which is usually measured in births per woman, which cannot be disputed. You can dispute what is a woman, but not births per woman. And that is that the world in general is pretty close to what's known as the replacement rate. Right, 2.1 births per woman is generally accepted as the rate at which we need in order for the population not to decline. Well, right now we've got more countries that are under that than over that. And the world average sits just at that rate and declining quite fast. Even countries like India are sitting at that rate. South Africa is sitting at that rate. It seems like an inevitability that we're going to have an aging population just purely because there's fewer children being born.
Well, interestingly, the UN comes out with population forecasts for this century. And for the first time, they're saying that the world is going to hit a ceiling of around 10.5 billion people. We're 8 billion people now, 10.5 billion around about the 2070s. And thereafter, the population is going to decline. And so, yeah, it's going to be a very interesting and very different world to the one where we've had, an addition of 1 billion people every 10 to 12 years for the last 100 years to the world's population. And again, that will have consequences.
But obviously, we still only have one planet. We only have one set of resources. And the flag that you have been following for a very long time has been the green flag.
Yeah. The green flag of climate change. And it first went up when I wrote a book with two eminent South Africans, Brian Huntley and Roy Siegfried, in 1989, in which they said that climate change is not so much about the gradual warming up of the planet and the melting of the Arctic and Antarctic. It's that it's going to lead to much greater frequency of very extreme weather events. And when I talk to environmentalists now, they say we got one thing wrong. We thought that these extreme events would happen in the second half of the century, and actually they're happening right now. And one of the descriptions that is used of the sort of rainfall that we're experiencing is atmospheric rivers. It's where the clouds are now absorbing so much moisture because of the greater warmth of the atmosphere that when they open, it leads to these unbelievable rivers of rainfall on the areas below them. And yeah, you've seen it in India, in the South Island of New Zealand, in California. We're getting these incredible flooding flowing out of this green flag. But equally, you're also seeing droughts. There are several countries, like the center of Spain, and certain states in America, in the south, that are also experiencing extreme drought. And has anything been done to curb carbon emissions, which most environmentalists feel very strongly are the cause of the warming up of the world? The answer is no, because you don't have, as I said, a positive leadership flag. There's been no action taken to try and bring this flag down, which is probably the one that poses the biggest existential threat to the future of this planet.
And this is going to be exacerbated by the conflicts that are emerging, because while that's happening, suddenly attention moves away from the global coordinated fight against climate change.
Absolutely. There was a British historian called Veronica Wedgwood who wrote a book on the English Civil War. But she made one profound comment. She said, man is a conflictual species. And, we seem to be more interested in conflict with one another than actually getting together to save our own planet. And what an unbelievable tragedy.
This has given rise and certainly fueled one of your flags, which is the anti-establishment flag. And that is that many young people see this as an existential threat. They see the establishment being the political and business classes not responding fast enough, and it's leading to greater instability through the anti-establishment movement.
Yeah, and of course, this flag is aggravated by social media. You don't have a debate anymore. You don't have somebody saying, well, I think it's this way, and somebody else saying, oh, well, I think it's that way, and then coming to a sort of happy compromise, which is probably nearer the truth. When a philosopher called Hegel, German philosopher, said you have thesis, and you have an antithesis, and then you have synthesis, and that moves you forward. But you don't have that now, because everybody has extreme views. And of course, what has made the sort of anger on both sides even more intense is the inequality in the world. I mean, ever since the financial crash of 2008, the super rich have got back to being super rich, but the middle class and working classes have actually not done very well, even though loads of money has been poured onto the world economy by governments. I think the real wage of a British nurse now is less than it was in 2007. So there's a lot of anger, which means that, people in general are replacing one government with another. And, you may well see it next year in the UK, because there's a lot of anger around there right now. And so, the anti-establishment flag is very much up the mast.
These kind of disruptions, be they financial, in some cases countries being dirt poor, be it impacts of climate change, where formerly countries that could feed themselves can't, that will lead to a movement of people. And you put up a flag for porous borders, but it's hard to stop. If you are starving, you're not going to say, oh, well, it hasn't rained for a while, I'll just stay here and die. You're going to get on a boat, you're going to cross the Mediterranean, or you're going to get onto your feet and go and try and get into the American southern border. Yeah,
look, I did a session in, I think it was around about 2012, with Interpol in Paris, where we had the sort of top of the police forces of countries around the world meeting at this hotel to discuss the major threats to the world over the next 10 years. And the number one threat, they said, was porous borders. That is why it became a flag for me. They said, we haven't seen anything yet in terms of, loads and loads of illegal immigrants coming from poor countries and trying to get into Western countries. And now, of course, we're seeing it in the Mediterranean with all the Greek islands totally overloaded. You see all these small boats trying to make it across from France to the UK. And of course, between Central America and America, there are lots of people trying to get in. And Joe Biden has just recently agreed to start building the wall again. You know, it is a flag. And again, it's difficult to know how the West is going to respond to it.
Staying with matters economic, because that's obviously what's fueling a lot of that cross-border movement. You have put up a flag for the debt flag. Now, for the last generation, goodness, nearly 40 years now, money has just got cheaper and cheaper. And countries, especially developed ones, has just loaded up with debt. And it seems like those days of cheap money has come to an end.
Absolutely. We don't know what's going to happen. I mean, you've had the sort of a bank like Silicon Valley Bank, going bankrupt, and there may well be other banks under real strain. In a sense, the financial crash of 2008 has made all the larger banks more conservative in the way they lend money. So I'm not sure that we're in the same state as we were prior to the 2008 financial crash. But, there are a lot of people in the world who are beginning to feel the heat of the higher interest rates, because we had, 10 years of virtually zero interest rates, and now they're up to 5%. In terms of bank lending, but in terms of mortgage lending, it's up to 8%. So, we've got to worry. And just take one ratio: the total national debt to GDP ratio in America now is 120%. About 10 years ago, there was a sort of economic rule that you didn't go beyond 60% of GDP. Well, America is now double that with its national debt. And most European countries are too. So, it's again something that has uncertain consequences. It's a cloudy flag at the moment.
Yeah, and certainly Japan keep quiet about it. They're multiple of where America is.
Absolutely.
Now, Clem, we are all very, very much dependent, and this even this channel, is going across a whole lot of social media channels. The few technology issues that may come into it. One of those that I found most interested is that space is getting crowded, and you've got a crowded space flag.
Yeah, and the reason is that there's no laws of space. I mean, there was a UN resolution, I think in 1967, said that the space is available for everyone. But now you have all these satellites, you have them orbiting networks of satellites, but meanwhile you have rockets going up into space. People are landing on the moon more. India's just landed a rocket on the moon. Japan wants to do that. There have been several close misses recently. The Chinese complained the other day that one of their rockets came very close to an American satellite because they didn't know about it. And it's something that we now have to watch out for, because of course the global banking system and the global communication system rely on these satellite networks. And if there is a massive crash in space and all the fragments then go into orbit and go into the satellites, it could create major damage. So, I think you might well see more laws of space over the next 10 years, probably starting in the UN.
And staying with technology, artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
That's a hot topic.
It's a very hot topic. I added that one, about 6 months ago to the portfolio flag. People have come up with all the kind of potential good consequences of this flag, that it will allow people to explore their particular disciplines in a much more effective way. It will help health, cures and all that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, people have pointed out too that it'll allow the cyber crooks much
Matthew,
more
there's a problem.
potential to sort of raid your bank accounts, get hold of your passwords, and do all the nasty stuff. And of course, it's allowing fake images of people and even fake films of people, and it looks entirely lifelike to be put on social media. So nobody yet really understands the true consequences of the artificial intelligence flag. But technology goes in waves, and this is the new wave.
And possibly one of the biggest impacts could be the taking of jobs, because it's going to cover a lot of things that people would have been employed to do in the past.
Absolutely. That's the negative side of the technology. The positive side is that a lot of people, entrepreneurs, are going to come up with new uses of this technology in which they employ 5 to 10 people or maybe more. And so it could lead to a whole new industry. So, we just don't know at the moment which way it's going to go. But having said that, big business is no longer the major creator of jobs in this century. It was in the last century, but because of robotics and all the other high technologies that are available, job creation is very much now in small business. In America, the latest figure is, I think it's over two-thirds of the jobs being created in America are in small businesses. So yeah, that's where the action is. And of course, artificial intelligence could well give real potential to new entrepreneurs.
Clem, turning our attention to South Africa, you've got some South Africa specific flags.
Yeah.
I've looked at them, and we can start. You mentioned crime and corruption.
Yeah, that's.
We know that it's bad. It's probably something that we are just numb to in South Africa.
Yeah, it's and we thank heavens have moved from the whole Gupta brothers era into something that's better, but we're still not yet on top of it. And it is a major flag because it is having a bad impact on our economy. And it is absolutely a major issue. And it's not just crime in the corruption sense, it's violent crime leading to people emigrating from this country. It is a flag that is absolutely essential to watch in terms of whether there's a positive or negative future for South Africa.
There is no doubt, though, that the response to crime and corruption has meant that there's a change on the political front. We've got a general election coming up next year, and you've got a flag around that election in 2024. Yeah.
In fact, it's something I talk at quite some length about when I do live presentations and webinars, which is this is a watershed election. You have the ANC on the one side, but and people are worried that they're going to get below 50% and then go into an alliance with the EFF. But then you've got all these opposition parties on the other side who should really be looking at an effective coalition. And I actually wrote an article several months ago for News 24 where I said it was time for the DA to rebrand itself, because it's no good just saying negative and destructive things about the ANC and the EFF. You've got to say, if we are the government, this is what we're going to do. And indeed, if it's going to be a coalition of parties, they've got to actually put forward a very practical manifesto that if they're elected, this is what they're going to do. There was a recent survey of young black people in Soweto which showed that they're not going to vote for the ANC, but they're not going to vote for anyone. They're just going to abstain. And what I'm saying is that this is a golden opportunity for the opposition parties to say, this is what we will do for you young people if you give us the vote.
Perhaps they were listening to you, Clem. We know that there was multi-party coalition talks that took place, and certainly on the State of the Nation, we've covered it quite extensively, and we'll continue to do so. Staying with South Africa, I just want to focus on a few things, because the current ANC government has, you call it the neutrality flag. That is that South Africa treads a middle path where South Africa's interests are served. But we definitely seem to be really going all over the show on this particular path. This neutrality path, explain to us the neutrality flag, what you mean by it, and where South Africa is sitting on the neutrality at the moment.
Yeah, look, I'm just trying to say that, as a country that is still developing, you want to keep all your markets open, including the American market, including the Chinese market. And when you have two nations which are, facing each other down, it becomes incredibly complicated to remain neutral. I personally think it's a very good thing that we are one of the 5 members of BRICS, and that we've now invited a whole bunch of other nations to become members, because I do feel that we are now moving into a much broader global economy where you don't just have 1 or 2 Western superpowers. And, it is going to be very important to us to be part of that BRICS alliance. But what we mustn't do in being part of that alliance is to shut down some very, very important markets in the West. And thus we have to tread a neutral road.
Clem, you talk about the entrepreneurship flag.
Yeah, and I said earlier that the whole nature of work has changed. In this century, it's all about, if you want to create 5 million jobs, you've got to create 1 million new entrepreneurs. And what really, really worries me in South Africa is that we do not put enough emphasis on what we have to do to try and integrate the township economies into the mainstream economies. There's a book by G.G. Alcock called Gazanomics, where he grew up in a township, and he's actually been doing research on the small businesses that are opening up there. And they're not businesses that just sell small amounts of stuff by the side of the road. They're genuinely decent businesses. And we've got to move to a whole new sort of thing in South Africa about entrepreneurs. I did a debate with Julius Malema in February 2016, where I said to him, I'm an economic freedom fighter too, Julius, but I have a different definition of economic freedom. I believe that it's not about taking over the land or the mines or the banks. It's about giving ordinary South Africans a much greater degree of economic freedom. It's about the banks getting together to provide finance for small business. It's about possibly having a kind of stock exchanges in all major cities in South Africa where entrepreneurs can seek crowdfunding. It's about big business actually saying, we're going to actually allocate 20% of our supply chain to nurturing new entrepreneurs. We did that in Anglo-American in the 1990s around our mines. We need every big business to do that now. And then we've got to get rid of all that bureaucratic red tape that is hindering small business growth at the moment. So I just want to see a whole new vision around that, because it's the only way we're going to bring down the hideous unemployment rate that we have.
You referenced your career in mining, and you've got a flag around infrastructure in South Africa.
Yeah. I remember when I did a talk for the Central Party School in Beijing, which is the inner sanctum of the Chinese Communist Party, back at the beginning of this century, because they wanted to understand how scenario planning worked. They showed me around the school, which is the leadership academy for the party, afterwards. And the one thing I noticed was the slogans on the wall. And I said to the professor, who are you quoting? And he said, Deng Xiaoping. not Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, because in 1978 he said two things to us. He said the first is that we've got to renew the infrastructure in this country because that is the platform for economic growth. And he said we as the party must do a lot in that. And the second thing is we've got to allow ordinary Chinese people to create wealth for themselves, which was the exact opposite of communism. And he said we were, at the time, were ranked the 100th nation economically on earth. And now we're number 5. And of course, now they're number 2. So quality of infrastructure in terms of long-term prospects of becoming a winning nation is absolutely essential. And, you know, at the moment, we're going through all these problems with our electricity. We've got problems, in terms of Transnet, the railways and ports, in the much wider issue of education and healthcare. We've got so much to do. And the only thing that is going to sort out these problems is a real alliance between the private sector and the government. Because the one thing which is incredible about this country is the resilience of the private sector here, not only through the pandemic, but also through the Eskom load shedding as well.
Well, Clem, you've given us much to ponder on. I'm not going to hold you to where we are. I know that when you wrote your book about the future of South Africa as it headed towards the new South Africa, you know, you were quite clear as to the paths to take. I think you're once again clear in the paths to take. It's not your call to make. You're just outlining the options. So thank you so much for sharing those options with us and raising those flags. Where do people get more information on your work, Clem?
Well, you know, there's the Amazon. Amazon right now has a Kindle version of Thinking the Future, which is a book I wrote 2 years ago with Mitch Ilbery for Penguin Random House, and it's done very well on the Amazon business section. And people can go to the internet and Google my name, and then they can get a copy of this article I wrote on the flags.
And we will definitely put a link to it. Clem Sunter, thank you so much for joining us today on the State of the Nation. Once again, wisdom that we do well to listen to. And so to everybody that's joined us, thank you so much. Clem, thank you.
And I would just like to end with a benediction for you and also for all the listeners. May the fox be with you.
And may the fox be with our people, and especially with those that have subscribed to the channel. Please subscribe. It is free. Thank you so much for joining us on the State of the Nation, and we'll see you the next time.